Hello, everyone from Sussex University. We're very excited to welcome you to this webinar, those in the room and those online. My name is Professor Emily Lydgate, and I am a co-director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory here at Sussex. And I am joined by some very esteemed guests. Our guest of honor, James Bacchus, who was one of the founding members of the WTO appellate body and its chief judge, or perhaps we could describe it as being the chief justice of the World Trade Court, and therefore is very well positioned to talk to us about what has become of the WTO and what might happen going forward. And we also have Sunayana Sasmal, who is a research fellow at the UK Trade Policy Observatory, and comes to us most recently from working on dispute settlement at the WTO. So we have a nice range of perspectives on the WTO. And what we're going to do is have a more conversational approach. So I will yield the floor to Sunayana, who's going to ask Jim some questions, and we'll have the opportunity to hear his thoughts, and then we'll have some open audience Q&A. So please do submit your questions online whenever they occur to you. So I will now yield the floor.
Thank you so much, Emily. Welcome to Sussex, Professor Bacchus. It's great to have you and finally meet you. So the WTO is on everyone's mind these days, and the multilateral trading system, especially with tariffs. But we see all of it happening through bilateral channels now. I just wanted to ask you where all of this leaves the WTO in. As someone who's been pretty much foundational, the architect of the whole system, how do you feel about where things stand today? And I wanted to pick your brains on what, in your opinion, are the reasons why the WTO is where it is today. Is it legislative inertia? Is it dispute settlement reform? Is it a return to the power-based system? Or is it economic security and national security? Or a development and trust deficit between members? Any or all? Very light question to start with, but I'm sure we'll gain a lot from your rich experience.
In reply, I'd say it's probably a combination of all of those things and perhaps more. I was one of many architects of trading system. It's an international endeavor of cooperation of the highest order. And I confess, 30 years later, that as one of the founders of the WTO, I'm beginning to wonder whether I might be akin to one of the founders of the League of Nations. But the lesson there, even if that's so, is that after the failure of the League of Nations, the world found it had to reinvent it as something called the United Nations. WTO is there for a reason. The reason is that we need a global understanding about how we're going to conduct a trade between and among nation states. The rule of power is always tempting, especially for those who think they have sufficient economic power to get away with it. But the rule of law is the only thing that really works. And we're in the midst now determining whether we're going to have the rule of power or the rule of law in world trade. I, of course, as you might assume, am firmly on the side of the rule of law. I do not believe that might makes right. You mentioned a variety of reasons for the current plight of the trading system. I think they all play a role in it. There are increasing reactions worldwide to globalization, which should not overshadow the undeniable fact that on the whole, globalization economically has been a huge benefit to the whole world. Trade is part of that. the Bertelsmann Foundation in Germany a couple of years ago conducted an exhaustive study of every one of the single member states of the WTO, all 166 of them, and it concluded that all 166 of them had benefited economically by belonging to the WTO. These are the benefits of basic rules against non-discrimination, of having tariff and other trade commitments that we make and keep, of having an independent and impartial dispute settlement system. Trade flows more and it flows more widely. Of all those 166 countries, the country that benefited the most was my own, the United States of America. So this is undeniably so in terms of economic fact, and yet in the United States of America, the opposite is increasingly believed by those in positions of political power and by those interest groups that have a say in who secures political power and who keeps it. There, it's believed that the United States has been harmed economically by virtue of economic globalization and by virtue especially of being a member of the multilateral trading system under the auspices of the WTO. So what do we have now? We have a retreat by the United States of America from the rules-based trading system. The United States is ignoring the rules. The United States is acting unilaterally in violation of the rules. The United States is raising tariffs to astronomical heights worldwide. The United States is picking fights in trade for no reason rationally. And the United States is beginning to get the negative economic consequences of that, as would have been predicted by virtually any economist on the planet. And yet there are no signs of any advance in this aberrant trade policy by the Americans, as we call them in Geneva. Of course, I'm one of them. It is a very difficult situation politically, which is the result, I think, mostly of a mistake made in political policy by the United States a quarter of a century ago. And the mistake was not in joining the WTO. The mistake was not in bringing China into the WTO. The mistake was not in lowering barriers to trade with other countries. Those were important things that were done that needed to be done, and from which we have profited as Americans, whatever China's trade transgressions, and they do exist. The economic fact is the United States of America has benefited from our trade with China more than we have incurred any costs. The failure of policy a quarter of a century ago was not in lowering barriers to trade. It was, and not at the same time, doing the things that needed to be done domestically to make certain that all Americans could benefit from the resulting economic gains from trade. Instead, those gains have gone just to a small fraction of Americans at the top of the economic ladder. And what did we not do? We did not have an overall economic strategy that included investing in our own people. We do not have the kind of safety net we ought to have economically. We do not have universal health insurance, for example, so that if you lose your job, you also lose your health insurance. That's not so in other industrialized countries in the world. We have a pittance of unemployment insurance for a relatively short period of time. And in the states that have been most affected by this transition, the unemployment insurance is the least among our states. We have not done all that we needed to do, not only to help displaced workers transition through training and other means to new and better jobs. We have not done what we should have done to help the displaced communities that have been affected by the economic transition to the 21st century. The transitional assistance that we should have been providing not only to those who might have lost jobs or futures because of trade, but also for any other reason. Most of the jobs that people believe have been lost to trade have actually been lost to automation. Automation is continuing and increasing, and if we can believe what's happening with artificial intelligence, especially, there's going to be a whole lot more of it through more machine learning and more increased labor productivity through technology. And we didn't do that. Furthermore, we didn't invest in public education nearly as much as we should have done. In fact, we're going the wrong way. We did not do all that needed to be done to maintain and increase our comparative advantage in higher education. In fact, now we're trying to destroy our own comparative advantage in higher education by attacking universities such as Harvard University, a magnet to minds throughout the world. We have not truly increased our basic research and development in the United States. Our basic R&D support from the public sector has declined as a percentage virtually every year over the past 30 years. And all of this and more has made ordinary Americans more vulnerable to change. And the fact that they have not had any kind of help at all in making their way through change has made them distrustful, increasingly distrustful of any kind of authority, including especially governmental authority and international institutions such as the World Trade Organization. So now we find ourselves in a situation in which more and more Americans are willing to accept political actions that go against the very core of American beliefs. And along with many other Americans, I'm doing my best to oppose that, but we're in the midst of it now. And it's going to be a hard fight.
Thank you. So you recently published a piece, which I think is worth a read for everyone, which really talks about and details very richly the benefits of the multilateral trading system for the US and other countries. And I really like that it busted some myths about some allegations that the US has been making against the failures of the WTO, especially in relation to China. But I also wanted to pick up on one of the things that you said, which is, and it was one of my questions actually, what gives you hope that trade rules based on non-discrimination will prevail? And you said very clearly that multilateralism under the WTO has benefited economically pretty much all of the world. However, we see more of these deals coming through, and we just saw one with the UK, and where we do see some levels of a potential for preferential treatment bilaterally and on a non-MFN basis. Do you think that this temptation to enter into bilateral deals on non-MFN terms is going to take over the world? And how can countries resist this temptation? Because it will harm the multilateral principles.
Well, let's look at what's actually happened so far. The President of the United States having imposed a whole ever changing and ever increasing array of illegal and arbitrary tariffs has also told countries that he's willing to negotiate bilateral trade agreements with them so long as they agree to everything the United States wants. And he promised to have all those agreements in place in 90 days. Most of that time is now passed. We have only one agreement. It's an agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom. I'm someone who continues to believe in the primacy of the partnership and the special relationship between our two countries, so I have no problem with the UK going first. But let's look at what's actually happened. There's actually no agreement. There's just a loose framework for what is supposed to become an agreement. And when you look in the agreement, there's not really much in it. And when you listen to the United States, it says, well, whatever we may agree with any one country, we're going to keep in place at least a 10% tariff on everybody everywhere for every good they ship to the United States. Well, that's a 10% tax on world trade imposed by the United States. Now, the good news for the rest of the world is that only 13% of the world's imports are by the United States, which means, and I think Americans would be shocked to hear this, 87% of the imports in the world are by other countries. Indeed, the overwhelming majority of trade in the world is conducted without any involvement whatsoever by the United States. As I point out in a forthcoming paper I'm writing now, 5% of the people in the world are Americans. This means that 95% are not. Who knew? Instead of buckling under to the current administration in the United States and simply giving them what they want, I think other countries should instead go around the United States, find other markets for their products. If the United States is trying to price them out of the U.S. market, and as an American, this is not what I prefer, but this seems to me to be the better strategy for other countries. And they should, yes, enter into new agreements, but not these take it or leave it bilateral agreements that are being offered by the U.S. Instead, they should, first of all, negotiate new agreements within the WTO. If necessary, excluding the United States. Plurilateral agreements within the WTO are increasingly the way to go. Instead of trying in the old-fashioned way of getting everyone to agree on everything before anyone agrees on anything, the old consensus approach. This is all perfectly legal under the WTO treaty, and it needs to be done a lot more. Ideally, the U.S. should be a part of this. Practically, they don't want to be a part of it. So go ahead without them. And if need be, conclude other bilateral and regional trade arrangements as well outside the legal framework of the WTO. That's the second best solution by far, but I think that's another way to proceed. And none of this will help the United States, but at this point, the world needs to wait until the United States is willing to help itself by returning to its previous bipartisan policies of supporting a rule-based trading system that can be a framework for lowering barriers to trade in the United States and everywhere else. I don't think other countries should wait for the United States to return to the negotiating table in Geneva, much less to the head table. They should go on without the United States, to try to do what the world needs to have done to modernize the world trading system to make it more fit for purpose in the 21st century.
Thank you. We also hear a lot about the post-hegemonic world order, and that usually is referring to the world order without the US. Now, we've also heard a lot about the term leadership vacuum. So this pretty much assumes that in the absence of the US engaging productively and effectively with the rest of the world, there needs to be someone else to step up. And those two alternatives are usually China and the EU. Now, China, do you think it has the soft power to attract people, to attract other countries to follow its leadership?
No.
Okay. The second bit of the question is, the other alternative is the EU. The EU, through its recent measures, the unilateral measures, which are green and clean oriented, it's really stepped on a lot of developing countries' feathers because they're not deemed development friendly or regulatory imperialism. So how do you suppose the EU can do better, or is the EU to take up the burden of the leadership position? And what do you think the EU should and can cooperate with China to make sure that we still have some form of a global trading system?
When I say no about China, the no is addressed the notion that they could be a singular leader within the WTO. To be fair, I don't think the Chinese have suggested that they should be a singular leader in the WTO. And furthermore, the Chinese have been very supportive of the WTO and of the goal-based trading system. There's much that they have done relating to the trading system that I think it can be applauded. My view is that there can be and should not be any one leader trading. I think that a combination of the leading trading countries in the world can find ways to work together more effectively, more cooperatively, to move the trading system forward. Sometimes that will include China, sometimes it will not. For example, on digital trade, I don't see China agreeing to a lot of the freedom that European Union, the United States, other countries would expect online and in the digital commerce of the world. But that doesn't mean other countries cannot move forward. And yes, it's true that there has been a reaction against the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. For those in the audience who don't follow these things daily, the European Union is going to be restricting imports based on their carbon content for climate reasons. This is well intended, in my view. It's also my view that it probably violates several WTO rules. The best way to see the EU initiative, I think, is to see it as an overture to try to encourage a multilateral address of this issue within the WTO, which is what we really need, and make developing countries a part of this decision, find ways where we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions relating to production and occurring through trade in a way that many countries can support, rather than in a way that it's imposed on many countries unilaterally. I'm generally opposed to unilateral trade actions, as you might expect of someone with my background. I think that a combination of China, the EU, Japan, Australia, South Africa, Brazil, India, the United Kingdom, and some other countries can come together in ways that can help move the trading system forward, even in the absence of the United States at the table. Now, my own prediction, at least for now, is that the United States is not going to withdraw.
That's
Think about it. Why would the United States withdraw from the organization? At this point, the United States continues to have almost all of its benefits under the WTO treaty while ignoring most of its obligations. That's a great deal if you can get it. It's not what the United States should be doing. And it's going to come back and hurt the United States increasingly economically, but there's no reason to withdraw from the organization. What I think the United States will do is simply ignore the WTO while showing up to pretend that it is still a productive part of the system. For some years now, as we've watched the erosion of the dispute settlement system through the construction and the appellate body, other members of the WTO have been waiting for the United States to come to its senses again. And I think they should stop waiting. They should simply proceed without the United States.
does that mean that WTO members take up voting as something that they do now? Because within the WTO, when I was at the WTO for 6 months, when if anybody ever mentioned voting, it was like a taboo word. You just can't talk about voting. So
Voting is a taboo within the House at the WTO. I know that. I've seen it, understand it. Like others who are committed to the system, my knee-jerk in favor of consensus where we can achieve it. But while voting is taboo, it's also permitted under the WTO treaty, even though it's never been tried. Let's look at what we've accomplished with the consensus rule over the past decade. Not very much. We have the beginnings, important beginnings of disciplines on fisheries subsidies. We have the agreement that has cut some red tape from trade, customs, and other places. So we have a few things, but for the most part, since the turn of the century, we've accomplished nothing in terms of writing new rules or improving existing rules on a multilateral basis. This is why I believe the answer is to move forward with plurilateral agreements, which I won't delve into the technicalities, don't necessarily require voting. I think we can do much more in a lot of areas: environmental goods, medical goods, new intellectual property, rights, protections, and obligations, so on a plurilateral basis. And that's what we should be doing now. Significantly, I want to add, since it's something that in which I've been much engaged, we have half of the WTO members, or nearly half now, involved in discussions, which may yet turn into negotiations on an array of issues relating to the relationship between trade and sustainable development. Subsidies, for example, circular economy, plastic trade, other very important issues. It is not the case, despite what many American NGOs will tell you, that the WTO has stood in the way of environmental and social progress on issues related to sustainable development. Largely, the WTO has moved sustainable development forward, not least in terms of its effect on reducing poverty in the world. Eliminating poverty is goal 1 of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. But there is much more that the trading system can do to be a more active and affirmative agent for addressing climate change and for achieving the other goals of sustainable development in social, economic, and environmental areas of concern. And this is what this so-called Test D effort on behalf of trade and sustainable development is trying to accomplish within the WTO. This could lead to plurilateral and ultimately multilateral agreements that I encourage members of the WTO to move ahead and move ahead more quickly as they do.
So plurilaterals would be one way of achieving progress in this space, but we also see a lot of more innovative trade practices and policy making happening outside the WTO at the bilateral level, especially through, we have Greek economy partnership agreements, we have digital trade agreements, digital partnerships, we now have critical raw materials agreements, so on and so forth. Now, these have been termed as mini deals in just within the community. What space do you think these mini deals hold in the multilateral trading system? And what do you think the global trading regime could look like in the future? Because we had spaghetti bowl of FTAs before, and now we have more of these regulatory cooperation kind of agreements. Is this spaghetti bowl on steroids, or is this something completely different from what you would have imagined in 1995?
This is not what we imagined in 1995. For those who don't know it, I was, before going to the WTO, a member of the Congress of the United States, and I was one of the 6 original co-sponsors in the U.S. House of Representatives for the legislation that implemented the Uruguay round trade agreements that established the WTO. What we envisaged at the time, those of us who created the WTO, the thousands of us worldwide, was that the WTO would be an ongoing forum and framework for addressing new issues in trade as they arose, and that we would include new issues as needed and conclude new agreements within the WTO legal framework. Instead, in 2001, without very much reflection, the decision was made to launch the Doha development round in the same old way, which is all or nothing, according to the traditional consensus rule. And we ended up not with all, we ended up with close to nothing. And it was out of frustration with this that a lot of countries began to go outside the WTO, and that bilateral trade agreements and free trade agreements on a regional basis began to proliferate. There are hundreds of them. And now, as you quite rightly say, we're becoming more creative in doing some of these deals outside the WTO. I guess the answer to your question depends on how we answer the question of what do we do with these agreements. An agreement to discriminate in trade in favor of some countries that are party to your country in a particular bilateral or regional agreement is also an agreement to discriminate against the trade of other countries. Economists will examine different FTAs and tell you how much trade diversion they lead to and how much trade, that's new trade, they actually create. It varies. But inherently they are discriminatory. They're a violation of the most favored nation rule, and they're permitted only if they fulfill the requirements of the article in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, Article 24, that permits such agreements as an exception to the MFN rule. One of my great accomplishments in nearly a decade as a jurist in Geneva was that I was able to get out of Geneva alive without having to say what Article 24 means and requires. We still don't know. We don't really want to know. So will these agreements divert trade? Will they create new trade? We don't know yet. Ideally, these agreements should be multilateral because we know then that any trade that would result would be new trade. So that's the negative side of this approach. The ever lengthening spool of spaghetti, the spoon and dip from the spaghetti bowl. The positive side is that these agreements can also be proving grounds for what we do to improve WTO rules. They're laboratories of experimentation for the WTO. There's a new approach on digital trade that's agreed between a handful of countries in Southeast Asia, and we have such an agreement. How will that work if it's transported to the WTO and applied maybe at first laterally and eventually multilaterally? The same goes with many other issues. Minerals and mining are becoming increasingly visible as a trade issue. They've always been important as a trade issue, but now there's more of a geopolitical aspect to that trade than we can recollect in the past, and that's only going to intensify. So maybe we need to ask ourselves some questions about mining. How can it be done more sustainably? What rules might encourage more sustainable mining and more sustainable trade and extractive industries generally? Well, we need not start out with a global agreement on that. I think it might take us a while to agree on one, but we might begin with agreements between two or a few countries that could then be shown to work and then scaled up and broadened within the legal framework of the WTO.
Do we have time for more or?
I think maybe one more last one and then we'll open it up.
Okay, I have so many and I could go on, honestly. But probably this is the burning question for us, for all of us, which is the interaction of geopolitics and trade and security, and especially economic security and not just national security under GATT 21. What's your take on how the WTO and WTO members should proceed with economic security, addressing this as a problem that it's become?
Well, the best economic security guarantee is to have a peaceful multilateral trading system, the one in which countries make the commitments and keep them, one in which they take their inevitable trade disputes to independent and impartial adjudicators for positive resolution. It is such a system that will provide security and predictability in trade, which we certainly do not have with all the uncertainty in trade that grips us now. In the past few sentences, I've basically been paraphrasing lines in the WTO treaty. This is the main reason why we created the WTO in the first place. And those reasons why we created it in the first place still exist. As I said at the outset, if the WTO did not exist, we would find very soon that we needed to recreate it, just as the League of Nations, and it was succeeded a decade later by the United Nations. And that would be the best way to achieve economic security. Economic security is not going to be achieved by any nation through economic nationalism, economic autarky, economic coercion of other countries. That is not the way to security. That is the way chaos and disorder, which can undermine security.
Thank you.
Great. I know these people and I know they'll have lots of questions. But I think I will kick off with one if that's okay. So I was struck by the.
Will they be even harder than her questions?
They were great questions. They were great questions, and I have no doubt she could keep going. So I was struck by the extent that you made a case for pragmatically divesting from and working around the US. So I was curious, I wanted to delve the depths.
Meanwhile, there are those of us in the US who will continue to work to change.
Well, that's my
US
question.
Policies.
That's exactly my question, because I wanted to probe the depths of your pessimism, essentially, because there's certainly a case for just waiting it out a bit. You know, this is an aberration, what we're seeing now. So that's the first part of the question.
I'm just waiting, acting.
I mean, let us know what we can do to act. But for those of us who are not in the US, should we, is there a case for not trying to divest, but just being patient? Or do you think that there's a bipartisan trend away from playing ball in the WTO? And then the second thing is Canada and Mexico. So as the UK, we are very sensitive to the position of having a lot of dependencies on a particular trade partner. In our case, it's the EU. So I'm curious what your advice would be for those countries that are really dependent on the US, but also suffering from a lot of these trade shocks and the instability and uncertainty of what may come. So how pragmatically is it really realistic to recast trade relationships in a short time frame?
As a practical matter, there will be some goods, some services that the United States provides that cannot readily be obtained elsewhere. And this poses the kind of problem you suggested. In terms of markets for your own goods, well, yes, the US, I'm happy to say, remains, despite all, the most attractive place in the world to sell products. But as the sheer mathematics of trade indicate, countries can sell in other places. The sad fact is there is very much a bipartisan retreat from trade in the United States. For all those reasons we were discussing earlier, I do not see that changing anytime soon. I cannot name even one member of the Congress of the United States that I would say is in principle a free trader. There is not much competition for the few of us who are outside the Congress who are trying to say that we should be restoring our previous commitment to lowering barriers to trade worldwide through the rule of law under the auspices of the WTO. I'm not competing with too many people in my country in saying that, unfortunately. And yet, I am not a pessimist. I'm never a pessimist. I am a relentless optimist. I believe we have a duty of optimism, and I also continue to believe in my country and in the American people, and I believe we will find a way to come back from this abyss and become who we really are once more. I believe that can and will happen. But if I'm offering advice to the rest of the world, I would advise, don't expect it to happen tomorrow. It will take us a while to restore America to being worthy of the idea of America that has always inspired much of the rest of the world. That is optimism, I think.
Yeah, the unknown is the timescale, I suppose.
Well, the unknown is the time scale, and this poses further problems, especially as it relates to climate change. In trade, we can defer lowering barriers to trade. In so doing, we sacrifice economic gains, and we lose economic opportunities. And that's not good, but it's not fatal. In climate change, we don't have the time for the incrementalism that we've always relied on in trade. Trade, you cut the tariff 5% now, and you cut it a few more percent in the next round, and then you do away with it altogether. You know, the emissions game is a little different in terms of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And it then becomes harder to say, well, just be patient. You know, the United States is still in the WTO. It's pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. A couple of weeks ago, the American ambassador to the United Nations informed all the other members of the United Nations that the United States no longer feels bound by its previous commitment to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I wonder why. As I said earlier, the first of those goals is eliminating poverty. Does the United States no longer want to eliminate poverty? And so on with the other 16 goals. The last goal, promoting global partnerships. Well, I think the evidence of current policymaking in the U.S. is that no, we don't want to have any more global partnerships. But at this point, there's little rhyme or reason to what the U.S. is doing in policy making, and the unfortunate consequence for the rest of the world is that they have to deal with this, even though they don't have any say in deciding directly what happens in the United States. They're still affected by it. My message is that despite what many Americans think, the world is less affected by us than we may think. This is not 1955. This is not even 1995. This is 2025, and the world is not shaped the way most Americans, and especially those who are in charge of the country now, think it is. The rest of the world does have the ability to do a lot of positive things without the United States. it can hope that the United States will return to its senses and join them not too long from now. But in the meantime, the rest of the world needs to keep moving and move faster.
Okay, great. We have about 10 minutes, so questions. I'm gonna go straight in.
Thank you so much, very insightful and then thoughtful, yeah, opinion and then observation as always. I very much appreciate. I have two questions. I'm international political economist, so my question is more for the institutional grounded design of the global governance. So first question is about in the beginning of the first answer to this.
Why don't you ask each question
So
successively?
first question.
You ask the first one, then I'll answer the first one, and
Okay,
then
all right. The first question is about the real scope of the WTO. So 19th century, 20th century, we went through the globalization, and the peak was over the last 3 decades. And then, as you mentioned, it says really through this globalization, the domestic, not only economy, but society and politics deeply entwined with trade. And we have World Trade Organization, but trade, is it WTO? Is it really can cover everything? So especially the national level, we had a WTO international negotiation. The domestic level, we have so many, each country has so many problems, inequality and all of these. So how this T can be the scope, can be expanded within the WTO reform or outside? Should we create
that's a
something?
key question. Very important question. In my view, deciding domestically how a country makes certain that all its people are able to benefit from gains from trade is not an issue for the WTO. Think about it. Do the members of the WTO want the WTO to decide what their own domestic levels of taxation are going to be? Do we Americans, for example, want the WTO to tell us what our top marginal tax rate should be? No, I don't think so. I certainly don't. I don't think that the sovereign nation states and other customs territories that are members of the WTO want the WTO making those kinds of decisions. Those are domestic decisions, and I think they have to be made domestically. They will differ domestically with different countries. You're right, inequality and the growing extent of inequality is a huge issue in the world and within developing countries. We have a greater extent of inequality in the United States than we should have, but there's an even greater extent of inequality in China. It's not for the WTO to deal with those domestic decisions. These have to be domestic decisions. What the WTO is meant to do is establish ground rules for how individual countries that are members of the WTO take measures that affect trade. If you take a domestic measure, a law, a regulation, administrative practice that affects trade, then the WTO has jurisdiction. This, in my view, is how it should be. If it doesn't affect trade, I don't think the WTO should have anything to do with it. And if it does affect trade, I think basically all that are needed are the basic rules of non-discrimination. And beyond that, it's up to the domestic countries to decide what may be important to them and what may not be in terms of their domestic actions. The second question.
Yes, the second question, thank you so much.
Is it going to be even better? So, go ahead.
Yeah, the second question is about the ideology. The WTO stands on the neoliberalism, basically, but the world of the current, where we are now is, as you said, well, the economic nationalism, and then I think it's neoliberalism is over. That is based on basically the geo-rivalry between the US and China, this systemic, structure that's not changing in the 21st century. And then the response to the super economic nationalist, the US, the rest of the world, the response is more double standards, They said, okay, we need, WTO, the MFN and so on, but what they are doing is, as it's mentioned, about being deals and also the economic security and so on. So my question is how to create, incentivize using the WTO, because the rest of the world, the reaction to the super economic nationalism of the US is using the framework outside the WTO. Yes, we should ideally use the WTO plurilateral agreement so that they don't have incentive. How to create the situation?
I understand. That's another very good question. Not surprising coming from you, my friend. I want to answer in two parts. First, I know that there are those who say that the WTO is the manifestation of some type of ideology of neoliberalism or something akin to that, some type of laissez-faire philosophy that it's trying to impose on the world. But that's not true. There is no ideology in the WTO treaty. And I'm a free trader. I'm all in favor of using the WTO framework to create more free trade. But if you read the WTO treaty, the phrase free trade does not appear in it. And there's nothing in the WTO treaty that in any way requires or mandates free trade. What the treaty does is establish a legal framework and an opportunity for lowering barriers to trade if the countries that are parties to the treaty choose to do so. If they don't, and over the past 20 years, the bottom line is they haven't, based on their inability to conclude anything, then there won't be freer trade. What the WTO treaty says is, here we are, here's an opportunity to change the arrangements for trade if you wish to do so. And by the way, if you're going to engage in trade, or if you're going to enact measures that affect trade, don't discriminate between and among countries or in favor of your domestic providers over the producers of like products from other countries while doing so. That's it. Some people say, well, China shouldn't be in the WTO because its ideology is something that's inconsistent with that of the WTO. That's not true. China certainly has an economy that differs from a lot of other countries. It's heavily state driven. It's a command economy, and on, as we know. But then so are the economies of quite a few other WTO members: Brazil, India, South Africa, others. What's different about China is not a difference in kind; it's a difference in degree, in terms of China's size, and in terms of its impact on trade overall, but it's not ideologically incompatible with the WTO. Now, in terms of your question about incentives, the WTO already offers incentives. What are these incentives? They're not cash grants to countries that lower barriers to trade. They are, in fact, what I just described. They are the aspects of the WTO that establish a framework for lowering barriers to trade. The incentives that already exist are the benefits that will result, the economic gains from trade that will result if individual countries decide in an exercise of their sovereignty of their own free will in choosing to lower their barriers to trade. Because the economic evidence is clear in lowering barriers to trade, countries gain economically from trade. Period. That should be incentive enough. The problem is that message has been lost. That message has not been conveyed. And in my country, not one single person in a position of responsibility within the Washington Beltway is making any real effort to communicate that message.
Well, I think that's probably a good note to end on because we're out of time, but those of us in the room will be continuing the discussion throughout the day. Those of you online, thank you very much for joining us. I think we've had a very clear defense of open free trade and a lot of very nice formulations and analyses to keep thinking about. So thank you very much, Jim, for offering us your thoughts. They were very valuable. And thank you, Sunayana, for your excellent questions.
Very much so.